Hey, Deanna Brooks. I wonder if they maybe snagged the owl out of this room for something else. Let me text somebody here.
I was wondering where you were.
We be here.
And iPhone 13 is here and Dana, but that's it.
Oh, iPhone 13 is a person.
Yes, iPhone 13 is a person. I don't know what person that is. But Alec, hey, we seem to be owl-less in Overlook.
Would that have been part of changing gears for any reason?
It may have actually been for my class this morning, or it may be for session meeting.
But it's session meeting.
What you looking for? Oh, the owl. I think we can. Can you hear me well enough, Dana?
Oh yes, you're quite.
I bet if Sue stood here, can you see Sue if she stands here?
Right.
Yeah, there you go. So we're good. We don't need no stinking owl.
That's right.
Sue, we have unfortunately a session meeting tonight. So some of our folks at 7 o'clock are gonna have to, they may have had to make the choice to go to that instead of this. So, but
are they considering the fate of their soul?
They're considering the budget of the church for next year.
Oh.
So it's not quite the fate of the soul, but it's close.
Right.
The fate of God, Guy's soul.
That's right. Oh, the fate of God's soul. That's fine.
But I think we can go and get started. That's okay with you.
Sure.
And I'm going to close the door because we may have people walking by.
Totally fine. Y'all ready? So I do unexpectedly have to go and have a rotator cuff repair on Monday, which is fine. So it's fine.
They give you a bullet.
Yeah. I have thought about y'all because, I mean, this happened very quickly, but every day I've had to talk to some unknown voice on the telephone going, let's talk about the history of your health and these rapid fire questions, you know, and then let's talk about how much you have to pay. Okay. And then let's talk about anesthesia. You see, and so I don't even know who I'm talking to. They're just these disembodied voices. So we're going to Zoom next Wednesday, if that's okay with y'all, because I won't be able to drive for a while, apparently. Which is
and as I said to Sue at the beginning, if we need to postpone,
I'm very optimistic.
Until like the week after Easter, we can do that.
All right, we'll see. That's very kind. That's right, can reread. Okay, y'all.
Well, it's better on rereading.
It is.
It is better on rereading.
I understand you said in connection with Lincoln and the Bardo that it's a book that teaches you how to read it.
Yeah, that's actually a really good place to start. So what I'd like to do tonight is kind of try to impose order on this story and lead up to what most people identify as the climax of the novel. And then next week we'll do that, and then the ending / epilogue. So I have some comments and some questions. So we've talked about the book as satire, the way it kind of interrogates what's going on in contemporary America. But I also want to talk about some foundational ideas in the novel and get your reactions to that. And then I want you to explain all these women he has in a motel. Is that what you call it? Don't you think it's more of a motel? Yeah. All right. So I want to talk about the geography of this place. So where does Tom live? Where's his house? Does anybody remember?
The New Orleans suburbs.
Yes, what's it called?
Paradise.
Paradise, right? So we've got Paradise. And then, so Paradise Estates, full of these kind of middle class professionals, yes, upper middle class. And they're all kinds of people, politically, philosophically, but they all seem to get along fine. And then you have Fedville. And what's in Fedville? Do you remember?
Is that where a lot of clinic is?
Yes.
And other behavioral studies.
Good.
Facilities.
Very good. And this is going to become increasingly important as we move towards the climax. So there's also this place called Fedville, which is filled with all of these complexes for the feeding and caring of the people. And they're all sort of set up as these clinics. And he, in the kind of middle of the novel, he sort of takes us there. And I want to talk about that before we're done tonight, because it's going to lead to this climax in the pit. So listen, we've got Paradise, a pit, a swamp. And so there are lots of ways in which you can read this novel, but I do at least want you to be aware of, on some level, what's the story? Paradise, the pit, right? And in many ways, you can impose the creation story on this novel and the fall of humankind. And so what we're kind of getting to in the middle of the novel, and we talked a little bit about this last week, but John Bailey, you sent me a note about sin. Do you remember? Can you tell me what it is? Wait, what?
Well, that's probably better than mine, but I like mine. Well, go ahead. Yeah. Sin is the assertion of self to the hurt of other selves without regard to the supreme self.
There you go. Do you think that works in this novel? I mean, it's so clear, yes? So over and over and over in this book, you're getting some iteration of self. And let me just read you a couple of passages. So Percy is using these existential terms that a lot of them he lifts from Kierkegaard. And what he is essentially doing is criticizing what he calls the inauthenticity of the 20th century. And I had this conversation with my students today about a completely different story, and it was fascinating. What do you think? This is your question. What is an authentic life to you? Like, can you define that? Jump in there, Dana, if you want to.
You think one would think that it has an element of purpose to it.
Okay.
For people that know what they're supposed to be doing, they're supposed to be seeking God. But whether 20th century Americans are doing that or not is subject to debate.
Okay.
I like that, but I take a little different tack.
How? Can y'all hear? Richard, okay.
What was your question about?
What do you think an authentic life is?
I think that an authentic life is a life lived with integrity in the broadest sense.
Okay.
And then I have to ask myself, well, is Tom authentic or not?
Yes.
He is clearly, to me at least, an everyman figure,
Yes.
but I don't know whether that makes him authentic or not.
Yeah.
I think Tom is in play. I mean, he's verging on an authentic life, but Percy wasn't just influenced by Kierkegaard. He also read Gabriel Marcel.
Yes.
Very much into intersubjectivity, and it's how we relate to other people. And so it's one thing to have a little Popsy waiting for you in the hotel, and it's something else to have a real relationship with somebody where you know who they are and they know who you are, and you communicate.
Yeah. Could you hear Richard?
Could you maybe repeat that?
Okay. He was saying part of what Percy's doing, he's influenced by more than Kierkegaard. And one of the things he's particularly interested in, and Richard's right, it's in every novel, is this idea of intersubjective communion. Do you know what that means?
He uses Martin Buber's language. At some point, I thou, opposed to
Yes.
I it.
Yes. So as we move towards the climax of the novel, we should talk about this idea of intersubjective communion. What Percy shows in his novels, and this will probably start to click with you depending on where you are, is that language is what we use. It's what we have to communicate, and in many ways to order the world, order our existence. But Percy and so many 20th century Southern writers, Flannery O'Connor, believed fundamentally that, like so much of what's become inauthentic, is language. And he plays on language in a million places in this novel, right? With terrible puns and names and all of that. But you watch the way in which these people talk, but never seem to have any authentic communion. And with Percy, a lot of times the intersubjective communion takes place when language fails. Does that make sense? So as you get towards the last movement of the novel, there's this old man. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Mr. Hyde or something?
Mr. Ives, very good. And what's wrong with him? He won't talk, and he's been diagnosed with mutism, right? And psychosis. And so I want you to watch him because he becomes a central player in what ends up being arguably the climax of the novel. Because remember, he shows up in Tom's office when Tom A doesn't really want to see patients, but he knows there's something about Ives that he's drawn to, but he's not quite able to articulate it or understand it. And he does his little wand and says, oh my gosh, there's nothing wrong with him. He's just too mad to talk. But in a minute, he's going to become one of the central players, because do you remember at that moment what, I get these names so mixed up, what Ellen says is going, yes, that's what she knows something could happen to Ives. What is it?
They could send him to that place in Florida where they euthanize.
Yes, that they'll euthanize him. And so it's this great moment where you get a sense of how the geography works in the novel, because essentially what happens in this future world is that euthanasia becomes curative. At least that's how they approach it. This idea that, well, you know what we need to do with the old people? And it's problematic because I think as a culture, when we think of euthanasia, if on one level, we think of it as a choice, right? That the sick person makes. Unless we're talking about our animals, right? Where what we are trying to do, we think is something humane. But when you start talking about people, it becomes a lot more problematic, yes?
Isn't there, help me out here, but isn't there a suggestion of eugenics in this
100%.
presentation of Ives?
Yes.
So it's not just to get rid of him, it is to make I'm going to call it the dream better.
Right.
I'm taking that term from something else.
Right. And for next week, what I want you to do is have these tools with which to work the ending of the novel, because in many ways, for Percy, the goal, one of the things that reflects an authentic life is the attainment of this inner subjective communion. Richard, did you want to say anything else about that? Help us out.
Well, I think it's interesting that Tom Moore spends so much of his time not figuring it out. You know, I mean, he's got these 3 girls stashed in the motel and so forth. And he periodically has flashes where he says, maybe I'm missing the whole point, you know, maybe I do love God and so forth, all that. So I'm sympathetic to Percy, and I said to you last week, you're asking us to interpret this book in a way that Percy says, I couldn't figure out how to talk about that. You know?
I know.
Once you get to the religious point, I don't know what else there is to say. And so he spends a lot of time with Tom Moore on the fence, looking at this is what it's like to kind of live in the world where you're pulled in all these different directions. And then just occasionally you have a glimpse that maybe there's something beyond this, something better than this.
Yeah, 100%. And that's so great. What I think you're right. What he's suggesting through much, if not most of the novel, well, you're right. What he's doing is diagnosing what's wrong with us, with as a culture and a country, etc., for most of the novel. And Richard's dead on. He has these momentary glimpses or flashes that there should be something more. Maybe God does exist. And then I think, Richard, you're right. And in some ways, it's utterly simple. If God exists, the answer is simple, yes, in terms of devoting your life, giving up your life. It's that very Flannery O'Connor thing where it's like, you know, if God is what men say, and Christ actually died on the cross to redeem us, well, you'd be insane. You'd be a fool not to drop everything and follow that way. Yes. So in some ways, Richard, I think he's kind of doing a Milton thing there, where he's trying to, in some way, explain the ways of God to man, which ultimately is a mystery, right?
Right.
He does that well on page 157, where he contrasts Ellen and Tom. I mean, it's great stuff that Richard is bringing to us.
Yes.
I mean, that's sets it out.
I think this is what you're talking about. Ellen, though she is a strict churchgoer and a moral girl, does not believe in God. Rather, does she believe in the golden rule and in doing right. On the whole, she is embarrassed by the God business. That's a great line. But she does right. She doesn't need God. What does God have to do with being honest, hardworking, chaste, upright, unselfish, etc.? I, on the other hand, believe in God, the Jews, Christ, the whole business. Yet I don't do right. Which you're right. It's a great line, because what is difficult is whether, first of all, the repetition of the word business is important. That have we, in a post-capital world, turned God into a business? Because people aren't here. They're in your session, working on the budget. Do you see what I mean? And when Tom says this, when he says, you know, I believe in this, and there's nothing rational attached to that, that could be what one of those glimpses that Richard is talking about. But part of what is so difficult here and is hard to work through is this sense that on some level, we want to define what God is before we invest in the God business. If you have an entire part of your city that's filled with complexes where scientists very carefully and impressively diagnose all of the things that are wrong with you, is everything rational?
We want to define God scientifically.
Yes.
Is what he's trying to address.
Well, and we've done that since the Enlightenment, yes, because, and it's so fascinating because, you know, if you go back to the 18th century, right, it's all about the beginnings of scientific reasoning and making decisions based on reason. And I don't know that ultimately that is a place where you'll be comfortable if you're trying to define God, right? Because it's not rational, it's supernatural. And in part, we don't have the language. And I think this is getting to what Richard was saying. I mean, I think that's where Percy sort of tries and struggles. But how do you explain God? And what we're asking people who are searching for God or embracing God, what we're asking them to do is embrace this mystery, right? And believe ultimately in things like grace, forgiveness, redemption. And Tom is just such a great example. And as is everyone around him, of course, they're ridiculous, but he's showing all the ways that we defer to experts as opposed to what we should be searching for, right? Everything becomes clinical. Everything becomes, you know, I can't say that word, septic. So I want you to be able to get a hand, because Percy's so hard. And this is what we call in the business a novel of ideas, which means it's a philosophical novel and in places metaphysical. And it's not the kind of reading most of us do when we pick up a novel, because it's hard and in places it'll make your head pop off, right? But in some ways, it's easy to get a handle on what he's criticizing, yes? And a lot of that goes to this essential idea about authenticity and inauthenticity. Here's what, and this goes right back to what Richard was saying. So he's also influenced by Gabriel Marcel, who calls us in the rational world wayfarers and castaways who are unconnected with other human beings and with God. And he says there's little in ordinary human experience that can remedy the longing we have for an authentic existence. So Marcel is saying that we've become so separate from ourselves, from authenticity, and from God. And how do we get, so we're all castaways, we're all wayfarers. How do we get back? Like, how do we get there? Right?
Yeah, I think there's one point in the book where that angelism, bestialism thing is out, and Percy says, perhaps it's when he says, you know, maybe it's all about God. One of those collective moments that Tom Moore has. And he says, maybe we're not pigs or angels, maybe we're seekers.
Yes.
Angels and pigs.
So there's this dichotomy animalism.
That's his angelism. Yeah.
Correct. That's what he's talking about. And that, I don't know. It, to me, it's so complicated.
Where did others will know that somewhere, and I can't find it, they define sin. You mentioned grace, and it's basically the biggest sin, the unforgivable sin is, I think, the rejection of grace. It's said a little more articulate than that.
That's on where the daughter's so sick.
Yes.
You're right. Right.
And
Yeah. I should have asked you to say.
Oh, you're talking at the end of the book.
it's at the end
She
of the
won't,
book.
yes.
Both.
Yes, she won't go to,
Yeah, it's on page 390.
Yes.
Dora did.
Jackson.
What is it? What is it?
It's about going to France to, if I can pronounce the French, I know what it's. I'll bring you some more.
That's weird.
Seems like that guilt feels.
Oh, absolutely.
It is on 390.
It's,
No.
I've got it marked.
We're just looking for something, y'all.
I don't think it's
Not that far in.
It's where they were talking about that his wife Doris wanted him to send their daughter to Lourdes.
yes, and
he didn't do it, and he said she didn't want to go.
if you did,
So can you imagine how hard it would be for a man of science?
Yeah.
To pack up and go there. And then he says, can you imagine if you ask God for a miracle and it's granted? Then where does that put you
Yeah.
in relationship with God?
Well, exactly right. All right, we'll get there, I promise. So let me just read a couple of more things. So part of what Percy and a number of the philosophers he's influenced by argued that the problem, one of the problems with the modern age is that we don't have faith in ultimate things. Remember, Nietzsche's the one who says God is dead. And what do we do with that? Is fundamentally the reason we are separated from God because the modern and now postmodern age have accelerated our culture so much in terms of things and distractions, and that we don't have a place where we can fundamentally believe in ultimate things. But at the same time, Percy keeps showing that we long for it. So how do we get there? Do you see what I mean? How do we cross that gaping hole? Okay.
That's what you just said, the inner office, the inner subjective community.
Yes.
How do you define that? You have to be, it wouldn't be easy.
So with inner subjective communion, yes, you have to be, yeah, that's exactly right. You have to be more comfortable with mystery, but you also need to reach for or search for that utterly authentic connection to other human beings. And intersubjective communion. So in the moviegoer, I don't want to give it away here, yet. But in the moviegoer, the intersubjective communion is when, I don't know if you know that book, but there's a boy who is disabled and can't communicate. So he starts rapping on the wall. And Binks, the protagonist of that novel, totally gets it. He totally gets that the guy's name's Lonnie in that novel, that he's trying to reach out and have a real authentic connection, communicating beyond words. And in some ways, isn't that what we aim for in terms of a relationship with God? It is ultimately a communion without words, because for most of us, the communication or the communion is either one way, because God's not talking back to you, or it's beyond language. It's mystical.
We tend, I think, and this is really heretical, but we tend to create God with words.
Yes.
And I think he's really wrestling with that issue that we can't do that. We say God's great, God's good, God's omniscient, all of those things, but none of it is sufficient.
Correct. And that's what I meant when I was agreeing with Richard, because in some ways he's like John Milton writing Paradise Lost. We have forever tried to explain the ways of God to man, even though the given is that it can't really be done. Which, and John is absolutely right. Even in the way we try to explain God, it's different in every building. Yes? And it's often different for every individual. And I'm as guilty as anyone else because, you know, I'll hear someone preaching, say, and there's that part of me that goes, that's not my God. Okay, what? Do you know what I mean? It's not how I see it. I don't think it works that way. But what do we do then? Because here's what Sartre, I can't do French. He says, everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist. And man is in consequence forlorn, for he cannot find anything to depend on either within or outside himself. And you totally get how that plays in the novel, because it says, if God doesn't exist, then everything's permitted. What does that mean? What does that, how do you interpret that? If God is not real, everything is permitted.
Well, I mean, Sartre says it's an embarrassment to the atheist that God doesn't exist because there isn't any reason to be good rather than bad.
Yes.
What did he say?
Here, Richard, say it again. Say it loud.
If God doesn't exist, then there's no reason to be good rather than bad. Which Sartre says that's an embarrassment to us atheists. I can't give you a reason to be good.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. And then that passage, John, that you were showing with Ellen, who doesn't believe in God, but she believes in doing good works.
She believes in being good.
Yeah. She believes in being good.
And Tom says he's the one who believes in it because he's an immoral.
Right.
God, but he's not
well, part of what we see in these in the geography of the novel is how this idea of anything is permitted actually plays out. And especially with Tom, right?
He
Who
said that in credo in the birth. He said, I care not for my fellow man. I basically do whatever I want.
correct. And honestly, y'all, I mean, you know, when I teach the Puritans, you know, we get to determinism, predestination, and that whole idea of, okay, are good works actually going to get you into heaven?
Of course.
Right? And the ultimately what's missing here is our ability to believe in those things that have, or those concepts that have become for so many abstractions. Do we really believe in grace? Like, really? Do we really believe in forgiveness and redemption? I mean, those are all these sort of ultimate truths. Now we're back to Sherwood Anderson, right? That we kind of take to ourselves. It's just like trying to explain the ways of God to man. Those are concepts that take faith, right? And the thing about Tom, and I think Richard's exactly right, he has these passing moments where he'll say something that's so simple, like, well, you just have to believe in God. I believe in God, right? But how do you do that if we don't even have the language with which to describe or explain? And so it's this. So one of the questions with Walker Percy always is there value in the search? When does the search actually take place? And what he's showing in this super exaggerated form, and I get it, is our lives are so full of stuff, right? Most of us can't become monks and just contemplate, right? We don't have contemplative lives. And so is the everydayness of our lives what is ultimately obstructing whatever that veil is, getting beyond it? So what he's asking. And Richard's right. I don't know if he can even answer it ultimately, but he does have consistently searchers. And Tom is such a fascinating protagonist to me because he's funny. He seems to be truthful about his condition, but there's been a huge separation in his life when the child Samantha dies, and for his wife as well. And then you go back to the way the novel plays on the story of the fall.
There's a huge gotcha in all of this that we haven't talked about, because so much of the importance of what Percy is trying to get at takes place in an insane style.
Yes.
And Tom may just be crazy.
Yes.
So, and that creates a lot of problems.
Well, you're right. And it's not an unusual or unfamiliar character in postmodernism, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Either he's the seeker who gets it, or he's insane. Catch 22, Yossarian. Either he's the one who fundamentally gets that people are trying to kill him, or he's insane, right? Tom Moore. And you're right. Well, Humber, Lolita. That guy's just crazy. But what it's asking you in this kind of upside down world is, does it take a voice that sounds crazy to us because of all of the ways we have set up our lives and lived them? And let's be honest, who didn't think Jesus was cuckoo? Right? I mean, I love that story. It really upsets my students when I say that, when I go, come on, y'all. It's me, Jesus, the incarnation of God. I think I'll find a bunch of losers to follow me around, right? What story is that? And then, so that's a really familiar postmodern character, but it's not even a brand new thing. If you go to Utopia and, oh my gosh, Don Quixote, it's the same kind of character. And the question becomes, and it goes kind of directly to what we're talking about. Who measures who's crazy and who's not?
So do we find God then in the absurd?
I don't know, Richard, what do you think about that? Did you hear him?
Say it again, and my battery's getting low, but go ahead.
John said, well, then do we find God in the absurd? Well, we must, because Richard disappeared. Well, part of what you see with Percy and Kierkegaard and Marcel is, and you see it in this book, is that unfortunately in the 20th and now the 21st century is that something apocalyptic has to happen. Remember, that's Flannery O'Connor, to get us, to jerk us out of this inauthentic life that we sort of live on a daily basis. Now, at the same time, you know, you go, well, so Tom is living this, what seems to be very ordinary life with his apple blossom gal, apple blossom paradise, just putting it in there, until his child dies. And what is so human and understandable is that it's a horrible death. It's not just, well, I mean, there's no way that having a child die is not the thing that should jerk you back or make you see things a different way. But Tom and his wife cannot come together in that intersubjective communion because they interpret her death differently. It separates rather than brings them together. And then what happens with Tom, and I don't mean this is a really bad phrase, he's unmoored by her death. So that's when he becomes, you know, and I totally get it. As Kurt Vonnegut would say, it's like the most human thing that happens in the novel for me is that it goes directly back to that idea that if you're trying to cope with this idea of how does evil operate in the world, believing in God and grace and redemption, those are all beautiful. But how does evil operate upon that? And those are basic human questions like, well, why can't God just stomp that out? And why would God allow or do, depending on how you see God operating in the world, how could he let that beautiful child die, that unimaginable, agonizing death? How do you walk away from that?
How could he let Jesus die on the cross?
Yeah.
The same issue.
Right. And how do we explain that? I don't know how the Presbyterians explain it. Here's how the Baptists explain it. That God allowed Christ to die for you so that you don't have to. You'll die a physical death, but then you have this opportunity for everlasting life. But again, that's trying to explain the ways of God to man. And so part of what Percy's asking are the hardest questions, but also the simplest. How do you experience these crushing blows in your lives and still believe?
Well,
and Tom sort of replaced. Oh, go ahead. Oh, Richard's back. Sorry, go ahead.
I had to get a little more electricity here. One of the words that people often use to describe Percy's fiction is sacramental. And are the things that happen when those really important things in our lives happen. I mean, a baby's born or a person dies or you get married it's the really big stuff. And I think Percy chooses things like the death of the child to say, okay, now I'm going to find out what you really believe. You know this blah, blah, but now I need to know, what star are you fixed on? What do you live by?
100%. It's awful. You know what I mean? It's awful, yuck, but it's also awful, AWE, right? Because I think you're right, Richard. And it's sort of like, have you all ever read Slaughterhouse-Five? Which is a book I love. You have at the very beginning, Vonnegut says, Lot's wife is either his favorite or one of his favorite characters in the Bible, because God said, what? Don't look back. And what did she do?
Look back.
It's the most human thing. I love her too, because I'm so scared I would do it. Because most of us are driven by our human needs and reactions and that everydayness, as opposed to some consistent searching, right? It's just, and what Tom does is sort of replace the life he had. And this is also totally Freudian, right? He replaces it with pleasure. I'll do what I want.
And also, when this was written, the sexual revolution had just started. He's at 45, his wife's left him, his daughter's died, and he's like a kid in the candy shop.
Yeah.
He's not abusive of relationships. There's nothing in the book that said he was unfaithful to Doris.
No. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But everything kind of reminds him of Doris.
Yes.
All of his affairs, he always.
And remember, what's her name? Lola? Is it Lola? That the first time, well, when he's with Lola, he calls out Doris's name.
But he's also humming something from Don Giovanni, and she really doesn't know it.
Right. So, all right, here's what I want you to think about, because I think we're totally together on what's kind of happening as far as Percy goes. But then we have Art Immelman. And like Ives, he's going to become a really important player. Who is he?
He's the devil.
Promote the machine.
Gonna commercialize it. Is what he's gonna do, sure.
And what are you telling me, Richard? He's who?
He's the devil.
Is he?
Oh yeah, the sulfur whenever he's around and so forth. And
It's awesome.
I actually went back and read the fourth chapter of the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus has been in the desert for 40 days and the devil's tempting him. That's Art Immelman. You know, let me show you. You want the Nobel Prize? Let me show you how to juice up that lapsometer of yours and actually use it to treat people.
100%. And I'm trying to find the place you're talking about, because the very first time, you know, Immelman just appears, right? He, Tom has this really interesting reaction in the way that, you know, as Richard says, he has these kind of intuitive moments where, okay, here, 156. Oh, 66, that's what I thought. Okay, so watch. Art Immelman is the name, funding is my game. I mean, it could not be better, right? It's so bad. Did he say Immerman or Immelman, like the German ace and inventor of the Immelman turn? It's a new concept in funding, Doctor. Art is shouting over the storm as he takes papers out of his attaché case. Number one, so he appears in the middle of this storm and he's carrying his attaché case. It's so Flannery O'Connor. It's Good Country People. He's an odd looking fellow, curiously old fashioned. Indeed, with his old styled flat top haircut, white shirt with short sleeves, which even have vestigial cuff buttons and neat dark trousers. He looks like a small town businessman in the old auto age. So then it says, when he leans across the desk to shake hands, air pushes ahead of him, bearing to my nostrils a heavy, complex odor, the intricate canceled smell of sweat, neutralized by a strong deodorant. Who is he? He's the devil. And then you go, well, he's a smarmy business guy. But as we move deeper into the novel, moving towards the last movement of the book, over and over and over again, Percy seems to be setting up this original story of the fall, right? That Tom is an Adam figure, Doris was the Eve figure, and now we have the tempter in there and he smells like sulfur. And ultimately, what's the point? So that's what I want you thinking about, because as we go into the pit, all right, let's set this up. What happens in the pit? What's going on there?
Tom is competing with Dr. Brown.
Yep.
And Dr. Brown said, well, let's see whether your machine works. And I don't know, Mr. Hyde's there.
Okay.
Tom wins.
Yes. So the pit, and this is so great because it kind of goes back to what John said, because, you know, the thing about Tom is he's never been officially released from the booby hatch, right? I say that because nobody ever knows what I'm talking about when I say that. You're my people. So he's like part patient, part doctor, which is fascinating. And then there's this sort of yearly showdown. And it's sort of set up like a bad Western, right? Where you have these two squaring off in the middle of the pit to have this contest. And the students are all around. So it's like Coliseum, Old West, whatever. So I want you to watch that, because that's at some point, and Richard may have, I don't know, given it away. I don't know that this is a book that you'll walk away from going, oh, it's fully resolved now, right? Because it won't. And so, but in terms of plot, there is a showdown, and then we figure out where the novel is going to end. And then I think we can answer a few questions, but maybe not all. Do you like this book?
I hate to say this, you all will be glad. I cannot be here next week, and I can't wait to hear what you all do with it. And I can't even get online. And I really, but I do, because the ending left me cold. I did not like the ending of the book.
I'm not surprised.
And I would like to hear what you all do with it.
Okay, well, John Bailey, you missed this part. So Monday I have to get my rotator cuff fixed.
Oh, good. Okay.
So we are going to Zoom next week. So it'll be recorded. Guy thinks I won't. Yeah, I'll totally do it.
Good.
So we'll record it. Did you hear him, Richard? The ending of the novel left Richard cold.
Of John Cole, right? Yeah. I mean, it took me a long time, because I think we all like things tied up in neat little bundles. And eventually you just figure out Percy doesn't think you can tie things up in neat little bundles. And so he just doesn't bother, you know?
Well, when he wrote this book, all those issues fragmenting society were still so much at hand. Vietnam War, urban cities burning every summer in the 60s. You know.
Didn't I see somewhere though that there is a sequel to this?
Yes, the Thanatos syndrome.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't love the sequel, but it's certainly, if you like Percy and you want to move into this topic and this man deeper, it's a good. Still nothing gets resolved.
I would argue it's not a sequel. He just brings back the Tom Moore character.
Right. And he's not even exactly the same. Right. So y'all, do you like this book? All right, let's hear it.
It's really, because I read it with different eyes. You guys are all theology involved, and I know it's in there, and I know time. But as soon as I picked up on the reference to the green buttons, things fall.
Oh yeah.
Then I went to his poetry and the Second Coming, and if you know Yeats, and I know just enough to be dangerous. So I don't know a lot, but I know just enough. Yeats reacted to his father and left religion, and wasn't about it. I mean, basically. He had a worldview which stated that every two that we are spinning, we're basically spinning in a tornado, a gyre. We're going around and around and around. And you can go back to your first pages when you were going to Kierkegaard, and I could interpret that line as this spinning thing.
Yes.
Okay, in this gyre, as we're spinning around 2,000 years, there is a dominant religion and a dominant government. Okay, was that gyre in 2,000 years is coming to an end, things resolve into chaos. This book resolves into chaos. And out of that ultimate resolution, we will get a new kind of government and a new religion. And I can take the ending because I don't want to give away the ending, but I read the ending as a resolution. We have a new religion that is defined in the character of Noah and Ellen.
Okay.
Because, period. And they have children.
Yep.
So it is there. And you can go back through the book. And then I thought, first one, I thought, oh, it's just playing off the second coming. And
Yes.
Then I go to Doris. And I go, oh my God, she's going to Innisfree. That's another point. She's going to Innisfree. In that point, we've got to get back to the old culture, to quote the old language.
Yes.
The old one. But we have to look for the minutes, which are the old world birds coming back. We've got to rebuild out with these little hut things. What do we have in the swamp? Little huts. Because the artists have gone out there.
Yep.
Which also takes you to what Yates did in his life when he had support from Lady Gregory. And, you know, and they were able to stay at this estate. I can take a lot of that with golf course and all that, you know, and they could build things.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't think you're wrong.
And then you go all the way through, and I can do some stuff with Doris and man.
Yeah.
And I can do something with those three women. I can fix your problem with the three women. Right now, I can tell you exactly who they are.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
do you think that they're each, we're talking about the three women, are they each an archetype?
Yes. I think what we're doing in the book is a satire. The nice thing about a satire is a satirist never has to give you an answer. They just show you what's wrong. You have to figure it out. The characters, I would say, I don't think Tom Moore is a sympathetic character. I think he's an icon. I think he's a symbol character. He's a symbol of what's wrong in, you know, the 60s world. I can take Doris as a symbol character. I think she's Doris Day. She's the idea.
The apple blossom.
And then I can take Samantha off of TV in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Bewitched.
Mm-hmm.
The witch who cannot use her magic. And you talked about magic 2 weeks ago. And so what does she do at the end of the book? She refuses to use her magic. She couldn't fix it. She could have fixed it all.
I know.
Every bit if she'd done it. But anyway, and what I thought is he's waiting for Marcus.
Yes.
And Marcus are spirituality.
Yes.
And then there's all this movie. I mean, I've got the poems. I looked them up. I said, oh my gosh. Oh. And of course,
yep.
And there's that.
Yep.
You're changing base. Oh, the one poetry just blows your mind.
Not only do I think you're not wrong,
That's good.
I don't know that those two readings are incompatible.
I think he's layered it out.
I do too.
I think he used Yates, he used his worldview, slipped in religion.
And this idea of the world, yeah, you need to write an article.
Adam's curse. Oh, I forgot Adam's curse. And I went, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And that whole idea of the gyre and the spinning, that's also something a lot of postmodern writers are concerned about, that entropy, the idea that it's all going to dissolve into chaos unless there's something to impose order. And what we have to figure out is that God.
But all well and good, and I love that. But the book ends with Ellen and Tom in bed.
Mm-hmm.
That is where this book ends.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a very mundane
But Ellen
context.
But Ellen is our good Presbyterian.
Yeah.
She doesn't read the signs and wonders, and he's the good Catholic who does. So we have the merging of the two religions.
Yeah.
So now we've got, and they have children, little Tom who's not, and Meg, is, you know, so that's what they have produced. It's moving into this new cycle of a new religion. So
I think that's smart.
Oh my gosh, she's got the eyes that you need. Did you not get that comment? Her eyes are really like.
All right, that's what we're gonna talk about next week. So next week, let's start with art and the pit and work our way forward. We good? I think that's super smart. All right, y'all. See you next time on the Zoom. I'll be in a great mood, probably. I'm not quite sure. I guess I'm gonna, all right, I'm getting ready to leave, y'all. Maybe. Or I'm gonna send you into a breakout room. No, it's fine. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.